concentrated power of will, 5% pleasure, 50% pain, 100% reason to remember the day.
Clearly, according to the song, percents are part of our everyday lives. But what does a percent mean? Let's look at this figure over on the left. This is called a 100 cube because it contains, you guessed it, 100 cubes. And we consider this thing to be something that's whole. It is a whole piece of black. But what if I took one or two of those tiny little blocks out? I've just taken 2 of the 100 blocks out. And so we call that 2%. But where does percent come from? Percent, translated, means per 100 or over 100. In fact, this little symbol here, if you rearranged it, would look like the number 100. So 2% means 2 out of 100. And that's a ratio. And we've talked about those. There's one other way to write the meaning 2 out of 100, and that's using the decimal. So listen how I say this. 2/100ths. We can translate that into a decimal form as long as you know your decimal place value. That's 2/100ths. All 3 of these expressions mean the same thing. They're just written into, 3 different ways: percent form, fraction form, or decimal form. That might be something you want to write down. Like scale, we can write percentages as proportions. Some number over 100 is equal to a part of something over a whole of something. Remember, these two sides are equal. In our little example where I colored 2 of the red blocks, we could write 2 out of 100 equals what part? 2. Over how many in the whole? 100. So both sides equal each other. But this side won't always be over a whole, which means we have 100 pieces. Our whole might be made up of something else besides 100. But we can still use this idea of a proportion to help us write and figure out percents. Before we move on to that, I want to give you a little clue. Just a little trick to help you do these problems. This word part, often in a word problem, will be clued into you with the word is. Something is part of a whole. And so when you see the word of, the number that comes after it is usually the number that will go on the bottom of that fraction. So remember is over of, and you'll be great with percent proportions. We're going to look at this example and figure out what number they're looking for using method 1, the percent proportion, which I just explained to you. There's another way of doing these with what's called the percent equation, and I'll get to that in a future slide. But we have the problem, 35% of $245 is what number? A lot of times we're going to see a problem like this when something's on sale at the store, and you want to know how much off you might get on a $245 object. So 35%. We use our percent proportion by noticing that 35% means 35 out of 100. And so the 35 is the part and 100 is your whole. Is what number? Well, that means we're looking for the part over here. So is the variable that I'm looking for, and 245 notice the word of comes right before that. So 245 is our denominator. So we read this, 35% is what number over 245? And we can find out what n is now by cross multiplying, or simply multiplying both sides by 245. When you undo the division of 245, you end up with a number of $85.75. So think about it logically. It's saying $85.75 is 35% of $245. This would matter to you if something was on sale for 35% off. That means you would be saving $85, and that's a big deal. Let's try another one. 16 is what percent of 28? Notice the words in the sentence. 16 is, that's this number right here. What percent? Well, that's the thing we're looking for. We're looking for the number that goes there. So we'll put an X in there this time. Of 28. There's the little clue word, that's the total. So I really have 16 out of 28, and I want to know what percentage that is. You can multiply both sides by 100 to undo that division. And when you take 16 times 100 divided by 28, you're going to get 57. So what does that mean? This is the number that would go up there in that fraction. 57 out of 100. Well, that's 57%. So your final answer in this case is, you could say x equals 57. But they asked what percent of 28 do you have? I don't really want to write an x there because x is 57. But we'll rewrite it as 57% is your answer. 16 over 28 is 57%. I'll do one more example with you. 21% of 1,518 is what number? Again, it's deciphering what's written in the sentence. 21%. Because that is with the percent symbol, it could also be written as 21 over 100, or the left side of your proportion here. And then the word of comes out. That's your total. That goes on the bottom. Is what number? There's your question mark. We need to solve for that. Setting up your proportion is the hard part. And now it's clear sailing. Just multiply both sides by 1518. You'll see that the missing number is 318.78. So the answer of 21% of 1,518 is 318 and 78/100ths. You try these three problems, and we're using this percent proportion here. Pause the video, show your work. Setting up the proportion is the important part, and then solve it for the missing number. Pause the video now. The proportions in red should always be shown so that we can make sure you're setting up your proportions correctly. And these should be your answers, and I rounded to the 100th place. If you did something else, that's fine, as long as your whole numbers are right. Number 6, you had to cross multiply. Whenever you have a variable in the denominator, you're going to have to cross multiply. Let's look at another method, which can be really handy if you like to just translate a mathematical sentence right into an equation. This is called the percent equation. It's nothing new or different than the percent proportion. We're just going to rewrite the percent proportion into this new form. So here's your percent proportion you've been using. And instead of the words is and of, I would like to rewrite this using letters. A lot of times is, they use the letter A, and of, they use the letter B. I haven't done anything new here. But I'm going to solve this equation for A. How would you do that? Well, just because it's a letter doesn't mean I can't undo it. So I'm going to multiply both sides by B. And I end up with this new equation. A equals percent over 100 times B. Instead of percent over 100, I'm just going to replace it with P percent, just to represent percent. This is the percent equation, and I'm going to use words to write what it's saying. A number, A, is, that's what equals means. A is P, a certain number, percent of B. Remember, of means multiply. That's where we got the idea of writing these words from. Is means equals, and of means multiply. So I could literally translate this equation into a word sentence. Look how handy this is, especially with letter B. So I'm going to skip to letter B right away. 12 is 42% of a number. Well, that fits this equation perfectly. 12, A, is 42%, P percent of what number? It translates. So I can say 12 is 42% of the number we're looking for. And now this is basically just an equation we solve for x. But here's an important detail, and this is true for any part of math. You never use percents in an equation. You need to convert this percent to decimal form. 42% just means 42 divided by 100. And so you need to rewrite this as 12 equals 0.42 times x. 42 100ths. Never use a percent in an equation, no matter where you are in your math. Now just divide both sides by that 42 100ths. Grab your handy dandy calculator, and 12 divided by 42 100ths gives you a value for x of 28 57/100ths, your final answer. So you can use either one of these methods, but this one's handy if you like to translate those sentences this way. This one's not written so beautifully for you, but you can still use the equation. What percent? Well, that's what we're looking for, is P percent then. Of 170. Of 170 is 68. So, read it the other way. 68 is what percent of 170? To solve that, you would divide both sides by 170. 68 divided by 170. Well, that's 4/10. So P percent equals 0.4. But remember, we'd like to write a percent symbol with this. So I could write P over 100, there's my P percent, equals 0.4. And so when I want to know what the percentage is, you can see that I would multiply both sides by 100, or move my decimal place 2 places to the right to show me that P, that number, is 40. Put a 0 in for a space holder, move your decimal place twice, or simply just multiply 0.4 by 100. And you've turned this into a percentage, 40%. So read what it's saying again and make sure it makes sense. 40% of 170 is 68. And that does make sense because 40% is less than half. 68 is about less than half of 170. So it's a logical answer. Last example. I'd like you to try it. So pause the video, fill in your percent equation, at least give it a shot, see if you like it, and then solve it for the missing number. Pause the video now. The percent equation is especially helpful in word problems that are set up like this. What number is 32% of 97? It's just especially helpful because this part right here, 32% of 97, should always remind you to multiply. And so this is quite a straightforward problem to do on your calculator or in your head whenever you're figuring out a sale price of something. It just means take the decimal form and multiply it by the whole number. And you're going to end up with your answer of 31. Here's a little extension on percents and their fraction equivalents because you see them so often. So on this chart here, I'd like you to fill in as many fractions that you can before I give them to you. So go ahead and pause the video and fill in as many of these percent to fraction equivalents as you can. And what I mean by that is say 25%. Hopefully you already know that that fraction equivalent is 1/4 or 1/4. So fill in the rest. Pause the video now. The ones written in green are the ones you may want to memorize. They're the easiest one, and they might have to do with money, especially if it's 50% or 75%. And then this 33% and that 66.6%, they show up so often that I recommend you memorize those. Now the ones with red are just the equivalents, but how would you go about finding those if you didn't know? Because I wrote 5%, you should be able to convert that into the fraction, 5/100. And then you could reduce that fraction. So 5 and 100 share 5 is a common factor, and so there's your 1/20th coming out. So converting all these to the fraction and then reducing the fraction will yield those simplified fractions for yourself. And then just for more informational purposes, can you write the decimals of all those so that we can decimally convert between these forms quite easily? Give that a shot. Some, again, are easier than others. Pause the video now. Again, I wrote the green ones as the easier ones. So let's talk about those quickly. Money, money, money. That's all I think about. 25% would be 1/4. And 1/4 rewrite is 0.25 or 25 hundredths again. 50%, that's 0.5. 50 cents would be written as 0.50. 75 cents. And then these are something you should just memorize, the 0.6 repeating and the 0.3 repeating, and that would be best done on a calculator if you didn't know. But then there's these, like 9/10. Hear how I say it, 9/10. Well, 9/10, if you know your place value system, is 9/10. And so you can convert that to a decimal quite easily. Or 1/10. Again, it's more straightforward. So let's look at the 1/5 and figure out how we could convert that. Now the easiest way would be just to use your calculator, but you could also make its denominator a 10. So 1/5 with a denominator of 10 would become 2/10. And that, when you write it, after saying it out loud, would look like that, 2/10. This would be 4/10 if you made an equivalent fraction with a 10 on the denominator on purpose, and so 4/10 is 0.4. And now when I'm looking, I just saw a mistake in my original chart. Perhaps you were screaming at the video trying to fix it. 60% would be 60/100. And then when I could cross those out to reduce my fraction to 6/10, and then that fraction I could divide both the numerator and denominator by 2, getting me 3/5. So this number here should have been 3/5. And I apologize for that misprint. Okay, so then let's go back to turning it into a decimal. 3/5 converted to an equivalent fraction with 10 in the denominator would become 6/10. And when you say it, it looks like 0.6 or 6/10. And then finally this would be 8/10. And that's how you would write 8/10. You can always use a calculator for those two. I'm just trying to show you how the math works. You can use this chart up here to help you estimate certain values because when you're at a store and you don't have your phone with you or your calculator, you might want to know what 49% of 280 is, but more likely you'll want to know what 50% of 280 is. And so converting or estimating, because we're going to estimate all these, 49%, make that 50%. And so 50% of 280 is a lot easier to do because you're just going to take 280 and divide it in half. You can write 50% as 1/2 if you want to, times 280, and then you can easily estimate 140 is half of 280. If you had to estimate 32% of 241 and you knew that was about a third, then you would be asked what's a third of 200 and let's not say 241 because that's not a good estimate. We'll say 240 because we know that 1/3 of 24 is 8, and so we could say 80. So estimating percentages is huge. You estimate these last two real quickly. 74.2% of 44 and 65% of 334. And you can estimate both those numbers, the percentages and the numbers. Pause the video. Now I chose 40 for this one because I can easily divide 40 by 4. Remember, of order of operations, you're welcome to divide first. So that gives me 10, and then 10 times 3 is 30. So 30 would be about 75% of 44. 65%, if you know that that's 2/3-ish, and 334, you could say is maybe 330. Because you can take 330 divided by 3, that would be 11, and then add your 0. So this would be really more like 2 times 110. And then you know that that's 220. So estimating math is super important because that's the real life application. You always want to know, when will I use this? This is the stuff you will always use.
We're all about it's like this, y'all. This is 10% luck, 20% skill, 15% concentrated power of will, 5% pleasure, 50% pain, 100% reason to remember the name. He doesn't need his name up in lights, he just wants to be heard, whether it's the beat of the mic. He feels so unlike everybody else, alone, in spite of the fact that some people still think that they know him. But